Welcome back to FryMinis. I'm Eric, and today in our Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft coverage, we're going to take a look at creating our own Domain of Dread. So we've just learned how to create our own Dark Lord, which is important because each Domain of Dread is built around a Dark Lord. So make sure you take care of that first before you jump into this next section. A Dark Lord lurks at the heart of every Domain of Dread. Everything in their realm is inspired by or personalized to them in some way. Some domains might be dismal ruins reflective of past glories, others might be cheery realms where the Dark Lord is forever an outsider, and still others might embody everything a Dark Lord once strove for and be awful nonetheless. A Dark Lord's domain often includes sights, sounds, and smells that serve as constant, painful reminders of the Dark Lord's wicked past. To start creating your domain, choose 3 of the evil acts your Dark Lord committed. Consider selecting those that best complement the player's characters and that don't conflict with any boundaries discussed in your group session 0. For each evil act, imagine the scene where it took place and then answer the following questions. What does the act sound like from a distance or to someone in the next room? How does the act or its consequences smell? What colors demand attention from the surroundings, decor, or aftermath? What shapes, symbols, or decorations stand out? What does the light or darkness hide or reveal? Are there any sudden or subtle movements one's eyes are drawn to? Who's there? How are they breathing? What are they feeling or thinking? Is it about this scene or something else entirely? Are words spoken? Are they relevant to the scene or unrelated? Where does this take place? When the scene is over, what evidence remains? Before this unfortunate scene happens, what warnings were missed or foreshadowed? Once you've considered these questions, write down your answers and review them. Mark or highlight the words that resonate or feel creepily evocative. As you proceed through domain creation, refer back to these details for inspiration. Right off the bat, we're pulling hard from that Dark Lord, so it's really important that we get that right the first time. Of course, you can always go back and edit. We're pulling from those evil acts we committed to build the sights, sounds, colors. What we're doing is building an atmosphere, I think. In every domain, instruments of suffering from the Dark Lord's past ensure their greatest desire remains in view, but ever out of reach. Even though a Dark Lord is effectively immortal, their psychology never changes and their wounds never heal. Consider the following reasons why a Dark Lord's torment remains unignorable and central to a domain story. Deathless returns. Those who die in a domain return reincarnated, fated to repeat a version of their former lives. Endless cycles. The Dark Lord shepherds another individual down a path of corruption in hopes of crafting a successor or recreating someone they lost. Despite the Dark Lord's perceived care and tutelage, the object of their attention never satisfies their expectations. Last grasp. An impending threat is on the cusp of overwhelming the Dark Lord and their domain. They can never look away as they are endlessly assaulted by cascading catastrophes, ever stemming from past choices. Obstinate ignorance. The Dark Lord is cursed to be unable to learn from past mistakes or to perceive their own failings, though they are convinced that this time will be different. Shocking reminders. The domain is drowning in symbolic reminders of the Dark Lord's inadequacies. When symbolism is too subtle, the literal specters from the Dark Lord's past return to haunt them. Unpleasant hope. The Dark Lord's desire, commonly their bond, is present and obvious, but still unattainable. This instills hope in the Dark Lord that they are unable to deny, resist, or ignore. Furthermore, they are overcome by their desire's presence, spurring them to act irrationally. Okay, so this is good. So we've set up so far that these domains are a way to torture the Dark Lord. And this is how it happens. It's all psychological, mostly. The domain's buildings, natural elements, and landmarks all represent the Dark Lord's vile past. When developing these features, follow these steps. Specify locations. Choose locations similar to settings that appear in your Dark Lord's past, or take inspiration from the settings table in your genres of horror section later in this chapter. Combine locations and visceral details. In a few sentences, describe how the domain's most prominent locations are twisted with suggestions that arose from answering the questions in the Dark Lord's Shadows section. Pair opposites together, something creepy with something cute, dead with alive, threatening with welcoming. Mix details together in unexpected ways. The more unnatural or off-putting, the better. Rationalize and normalize. Outline the justifications inhabitants use to pretend nothing is wrong. What could reasonably explain their surreal experiences? They claim rivers of blood are crimson due to natural clay deposits. The devilish lights in the swamp are nothing but swamp gas, and the current reclusive count is the descendant of the region's original reclusive count. Many of the domain's inhabitants are likely creations of the dark powers, and the domain is the only reality they know. But what logical or psychological leaps might an outsider need to make to sleep at night? I really like that last part. This ties back to earlier when we were talking about nightmare logic, about how some things are off, but this is kind of like a dream-like state a little bit, where just things are weird and we just have to go with it. As you develop your domain, consider the culture and how it emerges from this tragic setting. What might be the most unsettling for the Dark Lord? If the culture is one with familiar strictures, one they opposed, or were an outsider in, or something completely unknown or alien to them. While a domain's culture might take inspirations from fantastical or historical examples, remember that a domain isn't a functional or even logical construction. Domains are glimpses into the Dark Lord's static and often exaggerated or flawed perception of a time, place, or situation. A domain's inhabitants never develop and they never reach their goals. A domain's oppressive inquisition is no closer to rooting out evil today than it was 1,000 years ago. This isn't remarkable. It merely is as it has always been, and forces within a domain contort to maintain the status quo. For inspiration into your domain's culture, consider the following questions. What does the culture fear? What does the culture consider taboo? What is scarce, and how do inhabitants compensate for the scarcity? Who or what does the culture inflict harm upon? How does the culture treat outsiders? What values does the culture hold that not everyone abides by? How is the culture exaggerated, a parody, or otherwise unrealistic? How does the culture prevent change? What is the general attitude toward the Dark Lord? Don't get bogged down with particulars of a working society. It doesn't matter how a village in a domain of endless night grows crops, but it does matter that the supplies are about to run out. These details can fade into the background as your adventures focus on more exciting threats, or you can highlight the cosmic dread that declares, yes, this place doesn't make sense at all, yet it persists. For a specific example, consider the domain of Barovia. Not one villager in Barovia thinks it's wise to live in the shadow of Castle Ravenloft, and yet the villagers don't relocate, nor can they imagine living anywhere else. Life is as it's always been and could never be better, but it's constantly threatened with becoming worse. I think this is really good for role playing for your character, or for your players and their characters, to kind of embrace the domain, the culture of the people, just how they are. They're small things. So like it says, you don't need to go into mega detail on everything, but we need to set some basic things to play on. So we're almost out of gas. We're almost out of crops. It's going to get worse. Oh, the stuff's always coming. It's just having that kind of drive, I think, is what we're looking for here. Ghosts, mind flayers, werewolves, every monster is a story. Consider which monsters complement or contrast a Dark Lord's story. In a few sentences, describe which monsters best represent the Dark Lord's evil and which might work best against the Dark Lord's schemes. For example, a wicked scientist Dark Lord might be aided by flesh golems and crawling claws, but they are opposed by dryads and ghosts who suffer from the Dark Lord's experiments. For inspiration, refer to the Dark Lord's Shadow section and your answers to the questions there, as well as the monsters tables in the genre of horror section later in this chapter. Every good story, you're going to have something for it, something against it, right? If you're a werewolf, you'll probably have some werewolf allies. If you are a robot, you might have some robot allies. Just general things that make sense that is important to hammer out. In a few sentences, describe how the mists of Ravenloft operate in your domain. This might largely be the same as detailed at the beginning of Chapter 3, or they too might reflect the Dark Lord's nature. Consider the following questions. What shapes, sounds, and smells appear within the mists? Do the mists behave in some predictable way? What stories do the domain's people ascribe to the mists? Do they ascribe a personality to them? Where do the mists appear besides the domain's borders? How does a Dark Lord use the mists to close their domain's borders? The mists are important here because that's really what the whole realm is. It's also the border. It's how you travel between them. It's like the ocean if we were doing pirate adventures. It's everywhere. The story of a Dark Lord and their domain is one and the same. Once you know your Dark Lord and the general shape of their domain, consider the types of encounters and adventures that play out in this land. For inspiration, refer to the plots table in the genres of horror section later in this chapter and consider the following story elements. Captive audience. Determine some aspects of the domain or Dark Lord that captures the character's attention. How is this matter urgent and time sensitive? What can the heroes learn that points them to larger threats or the Dark Lord's past? How does this threat connect to the Dark Lord seeking their desires? Consider who might need the character's aid and might guide them to deeper mysteries. Detail key locations. Briefly describe distinct locations suitable for adventure, where the heroes confront the Dark Lord's threats. For inspiration, refer to the setting and adventure sites tables in the genres of horror section, or the supernatural region section of Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. Supporting cast. Consider what types of characters support the Dark Lord, exasperate their threat, or oppose them. How do characters take the Dark Lord situation from bad to worse, whether as fanatical supporters or tragic victims? Write down 3 types of characters who are aligned with the Dark Lord and 3 who aren't. Sketch out these characters broadly, perhaps noting only their professions or roles in adventures. You can expand on their details as your adventures take shape. Tangling the heroes. The Dark Lord might instantly sense visitors entering their domain, while the heroes have no reliable means of identifying the Dark Lord. Describe why the Dark Lord is interested in the characters. The Dark Lord's connection tables provide examples of such connections. Interact with the Dark Lord. Imagine situations that allow the player's characters and the Dark Lord to socialize without the encounter immediately spiraling into violence. For inspiration, consider the circumstances on the Dark Lord interactions table. The Dark Lord's connection table is a D8. An adventurer reminds the Dark Lord of their bond, desire, or loved one. An adventurer shares a Dark Lord's flaws. The Dark Lord and an adventurer share camaraderie over a mutual ideal. The Dark Lord believes they can teach an adventurer, making them their apprentice or inheritor. An adventurer is a reincarnated version of the Dark Lord's beloved or their murderer. The Dark Lord is convinced that an adventurer is the key to finally attaining their desire. The Dark Lord immediately looks up to an adventurer and seeks to emulate them to grim extremes. An adventurer is reincarnated younger version of the Dark Lord before they became irredeemable. The Dark Lord interactions table is also a D8. The Dark Lord promises to give the adventurers what they want if they join the Dark Lord for dinner. The Dark Lord contacts the adventurers via letters or dreams. The Dark Lord meets the adventurers disguised as a non-threatening inhabitant or animal. The Dark Lord meets the adventurers at a ceremony, funeral, or wedding where violence is discouraged. The Dark Lord meets the adventurers at a public festival, market, temple, or library, surrounded by a crowd of innocents. The Dark Lord possesses the body of someone the adventurers care about. The Dark Lord possesses the body of one of the adventurers. The Dark Lord invites the adventurers to a negotiation, promising non-violent solutions to a conflict. Absolutely fantastic. Those tables are all great. How to build an adventure, how to build an entire campaign we've got in this section. Rough out some areas, rough out a supporting cast, rough out how it's going to work with the players, how they're going to get involved, what their relationship is. This section is fantastic. Once you know what your domain and Dark Lord are, think ahead to the climax of your adventures. A Dark Lord likely can't be defeated by combat alone, so what's their weakness? In 1 or 2 sentences, describe this weakness, where it is in the domain, how the Dark Lord attempts to conceal this Achilles heel, and how adventurers might exploit it to bring the Dark Lord down. Then, assuming the Dark Lord is defeated, consider what happens next and how that's relevant to the player's characters, addressing the following questions. Can the Dark Lord die permanently? Under what circumstances might they return? What happens to their domain? Does a new Dark Lord rise? Does the domain permanently dissolve? Can the adventurers escape the domain? Do the adventurers return home or travel to another domain? A lot of this book has worked to set it up to where our goal isn't always to kill the Dark Lord, but sometimes that'll be the case. And sometimes maybe we defeat them not by killing them, but by doing some sort of trick where we destroy the domain. Something like that could be really cool. So it's important to have an idea, just a rough idea of what next steps are. At this point, you should have a wealth of information about your Dark Lord domain, the types of adventures you might run involving both, and a general idea of how the Dark Lord might be defeated. As you review your notes, consider where you can make connections between elements, establish recurring themes, and potentially foreshadow circumstances your adventures will focus on. Don't feel like you need to have answers for every question your Dark Lord or domain raises. Many of these details can be defined as your adventures play out or by focusing on elements your players gravitate toward. Now that you have a framework for your Dark Lord and domain, review the following genres of horror section. The details in that section can help you add exciting and shocking specifics to your creations as you prepare to unleash them on unsuspecting characters. So if you haven't already seen them, I've covered the genres of horror already in different videos. Check out the playlist to cover those. So this is amazing. I love this book. I know I've gushed about it over and over, but between the genres of horror with the monsters and the areas and the locations and the quest types, our domains of dread with what it looks like, how it should be, where it should be, what do we focus on, down to the Dark Lord, creating it, tying it to the players, tying it to some tragic, possibly, idea. This is just, it's a campaign in a couple of pages. This, I've said it over and over, but I love this book. So if you're still watching, please leave a comment. Let me know what would you build? You've got an entire world here that you can create. What does it look like? I'd love to hear it. Please like and subscribe, and stay tuned for even more Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft coverage here on FryMinis. Thanks.